something that we're doing already and something that we'll be doing a lot more of as these industry changes come into relief is going to be working with employers to make sure that people have a continued pathway within an organization so that they can continue their career and they won't be affected as acutely by things like automation. We think that's really important.
This is where it all begins, so say goodbye to all your fears, all your doubts. This is where they die. This is where we come to win, we come to fly. This is where we make our dreams come to life. Welcome to Innovation City.
Welcome to Innovation City, a podcast featuring the innovators, disruptors, and creators who are making things happen today. My name is Michael T. Johnson, and I'm here with Tyler Kelly, and we are in Venture Cafe St. Louis tonight. So Venture Cafe is the #1 largest gathering of entrepreneurs, innovators, creatives anywhere in the entire world. So if there's one near you, you're going to want to check it out. But tonight we have a special guest. Jeff Mazur is with us tonight. Jeff, thanks for being with us.
Glad to be here.
Super excited for this show. So Jeff is the executive director of LaunchCode. He leads a growing national nonprofit that builds the tech workforce in markets by providing free, high-quality training and job placement to driven individuals who lack the typical credentials. You've also served as a senior advisor to former governor of Missouri, Jay Nixon, and the executive director of the Missouri-Kansas affiliate of the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees, among other things.
Yeah, exactly. You got it all.
Welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Thanks for being on the show.
It's a great pleasure to do it.
So I'm curious about this whole idea of LaunchCode because from my recollection, you guys, in my experience in our world, we're one of the first ones doing this. And now I'm seeing these things pop up like all over the country. But you guys are one of the biggest ones, obviously. So tell me about this whole idea of re-educating people to take on tech jobs.
Sure. So, you start with the problem, right? And Jim McKelvey started LaunchCode here in St. Louis about 5 years ago. And, if you talk to Jim, he identifies what he does as somebody who invents things to solve problems. And the problem that really spurred LaunchCode in his mind was his experience as he was starting up Square, mobile payment system company. He's a St. Louisan. He wanted to build a development office for Square here in St. Louis, and he couldn't find enough people to grow that part of the business quickly enough. And so ultimately, all that work and that component of the business moved to San Francisco. It's a huge, massive global company now. It's worth billions and billions of dollars. And he wanted to have a piece of that here in St. Louis doing high-skill tech work. Ultimately, wasn't able to make that happen. And for him, that spurred the question, hey, that shouldn't be that way. There's a bunch of people here in St. Louis who want to do work like this, who have the aptitude and the capacity to do it, but for whatever reason, they're just not getting the opportunity to step in. And he says, how can we solve this problem? And for him, the answer was LaunchCode. And what does that mean from a practical standpoint? Well, it means breaking down the barriers that really keep people out of doing this work. And there are a few different ones, but one of the key ones is cost. That most of the time through history, to get a job as a software developer or working in a high-tech role, you needed to have a technical degree, a 4-year degree, and that costs money. And there are plenty of people who, for whom that's too high a barrier to entry. So he said, hey, one thing that we should do is have free job-focused learning opportunities for people so that people who are constrained by cost actually have a chance to build the skills so that we're not just using tech jobs as a means to perpetuate people who've already had opportunity, who already have resources. And that's been a big piece. The other part was changing attitudes in the industry around what it means to hire people for coding jobs and development jobs and tech jobs. There has been a longstanding practice where people get thrown out of the pile for jobs if they don't have that computer science degree or they don't have that engineering degree. And one of the things that LaunchCode says is, hey, let's focus not so much on the credential. Let's focus not on the pedigree that someone has or where they've come from, but really focus in on evaluating skill and finding people who have aptitude and who have skill. Who cares where they got it, right? Learned on YouTube, learned from an online program, learned in a community college, or got a degree from Harvard. It shouldn't really matter if you have the skills, you have the capacity to do what it takes to do the job well. That should be the measure. And so LaunchCode has built its programming around these concepts, give people free, accessible learning opportunities, and then provide opportunities with employers who need people like them, but who haven't found these people in the past because of their own rigid standards that they used or outmoded notions of who can do this sort of work. And I think what our learnings are, talk about numbers, is 1,350 people plus now over the course of the last 4.5 years whose careers we've started in tech. And these are people who, by and large, would not have had the chance to step into these roles but for something like LaunchCode to give them that opportunity and that connectivity to the industry. So, obviously the problem is much bigger than 1,300 people. By 2020, there'll be 1 million tech jobs unfilled in the U.S. That's a huge economics problem. It's a huge opportunity gap problem. And we are just one of many solutions to trying to solve that problem. But in communities like St. Louis and Miami and Tampa and Kansas City, where LaunchCode works, we're helping fill that gap. And that's, if you look here in St. Louis, LaunchCode is the most prolific source of new developer talent in this region. That includes higher education institutions, any other learning opportunity that people have. So, 230 new developers we're putting into the ecosystem here in St. Louis each year. And that's just growing. And that's, 2 or 3 times what SLU or WashU graduates in terms of computer science graduates each year. So, we need all of these sources to be producing people to fill this gap in the ecosystem. But we think programs like LaunchCode give a different audience, a different universe of people, the real chance to step into this field in a way that hasn't really existed for much of the life of the tech industry.
I think we can probably confirm exactly what you're saying, because we've had guests on this show, either founders or CEOs of companies tech companies that either one, they weren't traditionally good at traditional education, and they just kind of like self-taught or hacked their way through it. And at the same time, they're not necessarily hiring people that went through the traditional route of education.
Sure. Yeah. No, I think that's right. And that's why, some of these things, you laugh at it because you see people all the time. People who are wildly successful in the industry, and they say, yeah, I'm from a non-traditional background, and you see that. There's plenty of examples of it. I think one of the problems is when it comes to industry and you have employers that are hiring not 5 people at a time, but 500 people at a time, they're looking for the fastest and easiest way to take applications off the pile, right? And to narrow down quickly. And they use what are sometimes crude and only mildly effective means of narrowing things down. And so you miss people who have that non-traditional, atypical history, who are really talented and really skilled. And the biggest factor that we find that tracks to somebody's success, both in our learning programs and in job placement, is somebody's drive. How much does somebody really have it in their gut and their spirit and their soul to work in the tech industry? And that person is willing to learn throughout their entire career. They're willing to do what it takes to step into a role and to succeed. And that's something that in many instances you can't teach. You don't necessarily get that by virtue of having gone to Stanford or a 4-year degree program. That's something that is about what's inside someone. And those are people who can beat the odds and can use non-traditional mechanisms to step in and be really successful in these roles.
Yeah.
I'm thinking back to my first website, which I built in '99.
Okay.
And it was just self-taught, because there was nothing out there at that time. So Google it and figure it out.
Okay.
And Google came out a year earlier, so it was more like a Netscape, or something.
Ask Jeeves or something.
Alta Vista.
Something like that.
Right,
yeah.
Uh-huh.
But even though I have that background, self-taught, I know you're self-taught just in the things that you do. I can still see where that bias comes in, where somebody that went to school for this is much more qualified. So in terms of the education that people receive at LaunchCode, what are they, after they complete the program, what do they know, I guess is the question.
So our program, our core programs are designed to get someone over a fairly accelerated period of time up to a level of readiness to step into a junior software developer position. So what that means in a more specific way is we teach a 3-unit program over the course of 20 weeks. The first unit, people are learning fundamentals of programming taught in Python. The second unit, they're learning programming for the web, also taught in Python, and learning some front-end frameworks and understanding how to connect what they're developing in terms of their application to the web and how that all works and fits together. And then in the third unit, we really teach a deeper dive into a job-focused skill track that employers are looking for. So what skill track we teach, we try and align to where the preponderance of demand is among our employer partners in that region. In St. Louis, we have a lot of employer partners who are looking for Java developers, and so Java is the language we primarily teach, though we often teach JavaScript or C# as well as other skill tracks to place people in those sorts of roles. So, ideally someone is going through and over the course of that 20 weeks building that capacity. Now, I'm am I going to say that on week 21 that this person has the level of skill that someone who's worked in the industry for 2 years? Absolutely not. And frequently we know and expect, and our employer partners expect, that someone for the first 60 to 90 days of the time they're going to be coming on the job, they're going to have to learn, just like any new employee would, learn the ropes at their new employer, learn the technology stack in some ways that the employer is using, but that they'll have that baseline, they have that ability to step in, learn quickly, and then hit the ground running so that they can really be a valuable resource for that company. So, we increasingly are doing other sorts of more niche technology training as well. So LC 101 is our primary class, and that's the curriculum I just described. But we also have a program called Coder Girl, and that program has 7 or 8 different skill tracks. So there's a greater proliferation of skills that you might learn there. There's a SQL track, there's an iOS track. So there's some a little bit broader range of skill tracks to choose from in that program. And then a lot of employer-driven stuff that we do now has an even more niche technology focus. So we're doing a lot of training for employers who need people who are skilled in these systems like Pega and this stuff called ServiceNow. And people, oddly enough, we're training a lot of COBOL developers. Employers, particularly financial services employers that have these huge mainframe COBOL operations, need people. Their COBOL developers are 63 years old, and you can't ask them to hang on for another 5 years. So nobody's teaching that stuff anymore. So we're training COBOL developers for some employers. And so part of what our goal is how do we serve people who are looking for these opportunities, and how do we serve the employer landscape and industry in the markets we work? What are the gaps that really exist for those employers? And we view ourselves as a very nimble and quick to move organization, that if an employer says, I need 14 people with this skill set, we want to try and figure out a way where we can deliver it quickly and get them those resources as quickly as we can. That means more positive outcomes for us in terms of lives changed, and it means them not leaving money on the table in terms of leaving positions open for a long time. So that's what we've tried to do. And I think as we continue to mature as an organization, the scope and the breadth of the number of technologies and trainings that we're providing is going to continue to grow.
So you mentioned 2 groups of people, employers and workers. So what's coming? Like, what's in the future that makes what you do so important that both need to be prepared for?
Yeah. So, I mean, listen, the pat answer here, and it's true, right, is automation. And so you have a bunch of employers who are, at least the forward-looking ones, who are thinking to themselves, okay, I know that we will be automating a bunch of certain types of jobs within our organizations. And one of the things that we press our employer partners to do is really think about, hey, you have people on your team who are in these roles that are going to be automated. How do you provide cheap, accelerated skills to those people so that they can move into roles that are harder to fill within your organizations? Retraining the existing workforce for people who already have all of the solid work qualities and soft skills that an employer wants, and just developing within them a new skill set. And so, I think something that we're doing already, and something that we'll be doing a lot more of as these industry changes come into relief, is going to be working with employers to make sure that people have a continued pathway within an organization so that they can continue their career and they won't be affected as acutely by things like automation. We think that's really important. I mean, we think generally, if you look at studies, there's great folks who do great work at the Brookings Institution in DC, particularly the Metropolitan Policy Project. They have all this great data and this research that they've done around the digitalization of work in America now, and looking at cities and how over time the jobs, the skills that people need, even in not particularly technical jobs, are increasing quickly in terms of what the digital content of those jobs are. So even outside of the context of providing skills so people can step into coding jobs, how can we be a positive influence in helping people build the skills that we know the economy is going to be demanding in jobs that we don't typically think of as tech jobs? There's going to be very important things for our economy in St. Louis as a region so that we can continue to compete, and certainly very important for those individuals who are looking to make sure that their skills are relevant 10 months from now, 10 years from now.
Yeah.
So why Miami? Why Tampa? I mean, Kansas City makes sense, right? That was I'm assuming, second.
Yeah, Miami was actually our second spot.
Wow. So
yeah,
why,
we went to Miami next.
Why those choices?
So Miami was a weird confluence of circumstances. I think Jim McKelvey at that point was spending a lot of time living in Miami, and so he was able to help get that spun up. We had really great partners there. There's a foundation called the Knight Foundation that's very invested in the success of a number of markets around the country, but certainly in Miami as well. And they said, hey, we see what you're doing in St. Louis. We want to build something similar to that in Miami. Why don't you guys come here? And so they generously provided funding really to get us for our first 3 years of operation in Miami, and it's been a tremendous thing. Miami has Miami has a lot of great things going for it. One of the things that is harder there is that there aren't as many like huge corporate headquarters and things in Miami as there once were, and so we can't find the big pots of jobs as much as we might in St. Louis. But like, it's such a vibrant community. There's so many things going on there, and there's so many people we found that are excited and thirsty for the learning opportunities that we have in Miami. So it's been a really tremendous place. Now, how do we look at market in general and whether we know it's a good launch code market or not? One of the things that we've developed as a metric for making that determination over time is what we call a launch code index. And basically we take these federal job numbers, Bureau of Labor Statistic numbers, and they have all this data for very specific job classes. And so we kind of agglomerate a few different software developer and software-centric job classes together. And then we look at data for like the 50 biggest markets in the country. And we say, what's the actual versus expected in these sorts of employment in that market? So take the actual number of people in these roles, and then you look at an expected number in that market based on total employment in the market. And if that number is negative, in other words, if there's fewer jobs in that market than you'd expect, or fewer people working in these jobs than you'd expect based on total employment, that's typically a good launch code city, because it means there's not enough tech talent for those jobs to grow there. And so it's a place where we can come in and really move the needle. The places where we have a harder time, and this was certainly true in Seattle. We worked in Seattle for about 15 months and ultimately decided that we weren't going to work there anymore, because in Seattle, the dynamic is very different. They are way above the line. They've got 200 times more than you'd expect based on employment in that market. And so that creates a dynamic where it's a destination market for people in tech. So people will come there with skills, without a job in hand, and then it becomes very difficult for us to get our people in the door for that entry-level job. So looking at that, a launch code index is one way we can use labor market data in a way that gives us a little better sense for how effective we might be in a market, and which markets really most need some juicing, some alternative means of pumping new talent into that market so they can start to creep up a little bit there.
I'm curious from that, what are the markets that need the most talent right now?
Yeah, so if you look at the ones that are at the very bottom of the launch code index, like Los Angeles is far and away well below the line, just in terms of it's huge and there's not a lot of software employment there. Houston is another huge market in the U.S. where they need a lot of help. There traditionally hasn't been a lot of tech there. It's been more energy and these sorts of things. So you look at some of the cities that we're in, and they're not, because they're not as big as those cities, but they're on the negative side of the line. You look at St. Louis, we're at like a negative 3,800 below what you'd expect. And that's fairly similar to Tampa, which is there. Miami below the line as well, a little bit further below. But when you look across the country, you really find the top, 8 or 9 markets are the ones that are really well above the line. And then you have a lot of that are just sort of at the line, and then you start to tail off in some that have some pretty substantial deficit from what you'd expect. So it's interesting. It's an imperfect measure of these things, but it's certainly been a valuable tool for us to try and use as much as we can data to drive our decision making about where we can help and where maybe we can't.
Yeah. So we have on multiple occasions here at Venture Cafe met people that have been through your program and had no experience coding, and then 9 months later they have a full-time job. Sure. Which I think is just amazing that you've got a program that's that effective for people. Yeah,
we're glad to hear it. I mean, those are the stories that make us want to do this work, right? It's a great thing. The best job I get to do, every time a class graduates, we just at the beginning of July had graduations, a couple hundred people from our LC 101 class. And, piece that we always do at every graduation is just an open mic. Have somebody come up who's graduated the program and say, hey, tell us anything. Tell us where you came from, how you got to here, what this has meant to you. And those are the things that make you say, you always know why you do it. This is important work, but you see in very clear relief in those moments that these are people whose lives you changed that, but for the program, would have been on a totally different track. So that's really cool. And when I think about the potential scope of that, I mean, at our various markets right now, there are more than 1,000 people enrolled in Launch Code learning programs right now, about 700 of those here in St. Louis. So that's just so many people that it's having an impact on. Is every one of those people going to wind up working in a developer job 7 months from now? No, probably not. Some of those people have jobs already and are looking to build skills for that. Some people are doing this for different reasons. Some people will try and maybe just find that it's not really a career path that they want to go into, but we think all that's valuable. I think one of the dynamics that's always existed in this space in terms of training people for tech jobs and how tech hiring happens is you look at the typical mechanisms through which someone goes through, and they're almost always high barrier to entry and high cost of failure. So if you decide that you want to go through a computer science 4-year degree program, that's your path to a tech career, right? You're going to put a lot of money on the table, and to the extent you get a year in, 3 semesters in, 2 years in, and it doesn't work out and it fails, the cost of failure in that has been massive, right? In terms of opportunity cost for what you could have been doing for those years and for the money that you've put on the table that is now wasted. And part of that is about the orientation of a program to failure. Our view is, we think, a much more enlightened approach to this, where our deal is, hey, let's make the barriers to entry much lower and the cost of failure much lower. So, if you start a launch code program, you've paid no money. You go through, you're spending 6 hours a week in class for 20 weeks, and you're going to spend 12 to 15 hours a week of work a week outside the classroom. If you do that for 2 months and then it doesn't work out, look, it's not that it was zero cost to you, but that cost in comparison to having given up your day job to do a full-time learning program or plunking down $20,000 a year for a degree program, the cost is minuscule compared to those things. And so we feel like in a field where the gap is so huge, where there's such a need, that the continued reliance on these programs that have such high barrier to entry is a really, really bad route to go. We say, hey, let's throw it open. We throw it open to 300 people who just started our classes in July and we know about 65% are going to complete. Well, now, maybe that's not a great graduation rate for a computer science degree program. I don't really know, but we think it's really great for a free program. And we know that even the people who didn't complete, they got something out of it, and the costs were very minimal to them. So this is a way to really put way more people in the pathway to doing this, to fill the gap more quickly in a way that most of the traditional programs would do. Any of the institutions of higher education here in St. Louis or any other cities we work, if you were to go to them and say, hey, like, your city needs a bunch more software developers, can you just triple the number of people who graduate from your computer science program? Well, they'd say, well, first of all, we couldn't even do that until really 4 years from now, and it would take us a year and a half to get the new program and how can we get these people into, like, the basic answer would be, maybe it would be a huge feat, but probably not. And even if you could do it, it only starts to solve the problem years and years down the road. Yeah. So how do you get more people in? How do you fail more quickly in true startup fashion? And how do you get as many people you can on that road and see where it takes them, and have them not have to go into Hawk in order to have made that choice? So we think that's a real innovation and a disruptive force in how training for tech jobs has typically worked.
So for the people out there listening thinking, I might make a good coder, or more specifically, I just want to do something else with my life,
sure.
Right? You mentioned earlier drive. You have to have the drive, the desire to succeed.
Yep.
Is there anything else that makes a good candidate? Like, can all people learn to code? Like, how's this work?
There's been, I think, what I believe to be this false notion that's developed over the years that there are certain people who are like, born to code, and those are the only people who are really cut out for these careers. And there's no doubt that there's some people who are probably particularly predisposed to be good at this stuff, but we approach it as a skill that can be learned and taught like many other job-focused skills. And I think that's the direction of the industry. And so, some of the things we look at, certainly drive and the real desire, the sort of person who takes apart their computer or their things to see how they work and is curious in that way. Somebody who has the constitution to sit with a problem for a long time, and even if they can't come up with a solution right away, to come back to it and not give up. That's a very critical piece of this, because it can be a frustrating proposition, learning to code. So those are very important, I think, characteristics. And then in terms of foundational level of skill, I mean, it's hard to put a real gauge on these things, but for rough purposes, we usually talk about people needing 10th grade or equivalent math skills. Can you do basic algebra? And you have basic proficiency in logical reasoning and problem solving. Can you kind of parse and understand data, use that data to make conclusions and solve problems? And then do you have you have basic level of digital literacy. Do you understand how to manipulate a file system on a computer and do that sort of basic digital work? And if you have those skills and you have the willingness to work on it, and you're somebody who can sit with a problem and you have that grit to stick with something when it gets hard, then those are people who are going to be, on the whole, successful in a program like ours.
So for you, like obviously a lot of the stuff you're talking about is very specific to launch code. And for you personally, you probably have a lot of overlap in mission and things that you're trying to accomplish. But for you, like what's the why for you, or maybe the common thread in everything that you've kind of done?
Yeah, I most of the things that I've done in my career have been because I've been attracted to the mission, and whether those things have been in the public policy or electoral politics world, or in government, or in the labor movement, or at Launch Code, there's been a core of it that's around how do I take whatever skills that I have, whatever talents I've been given, and try and put those to work in a way that's going to help somebody else. And many of them have been about finding ways to help regular people empower themselves, or empower themselves with the help of others, to get a step ahead of where they are, where they started in life. And that's the kind of fulfillment that I've been looking for most of my career, and it's something that I've certainly been able to find in Launch Code. I think the ethos there is very much in line with this. How do we change the world by giving people opportunity to just express themselves and let these things out of them that are in there, but they haven't been given the tools or the mechanism or the opportunity to unleash, and that's a really powerful thing. And that is something that set aside motivations for personal financial gain or money. Those haven't typically been the things that have motivated me through my career. It's been about saying, how can I leave wherever I am a little bit better, and see that somebody's life has been impacted in a meaningfully positive way by what I've done. And you try, and sometimes you succeed, and sometimes you fail. You can't always help everybody, and that's where disappointment comes in. But being able to get up every day and go to work doing something that you feel good about at your core has really been what it's about for me. And so, I couldn't be luckier than I am to get to do the work that I do at Launch Code.
Yeah.
That's awesome. So I hear you're on Twitter.
I'm on Twitter. Yeah. Uh-huh.
And it's an acquired taste. Is that?
I think that's a fair way to put it. I mean, it's it's a mess of Launch Code promotional stuff, ridiculous irony tweets, some a very occasional earnest tweet about politics or policy or something going on in the world, some Mizzou sports mixed in season. So it's a hodgepodge.
Right.
I wouldn't recommend it, but check it out at JMAZ, JMAZ, if you're into that sort of stuff.
Cool. And Launch Code, where can people
find
more?
So launchcode.org, launchcode.org/learn if you want to look at the various learning programs that are open. We don't have any applications open in any of our markets right now. We just started a bunch of classes in July in all our markets. But if you look on there, you see the programs that Launch Code has, and you'll see the opportunities as they come up to apply for one of our classes. So check it out on social media. It's at Launch Code on Twitter. So you can check out the feed there for Launch Code stuff.
Awesome. Jeff, thank you.
Yeah, it's a great pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Mike.
For more episodes, visit innovationcity.co. Be sure to subscribe, rate, and review. If you're in St. Louis, visit us on a Thursday night. You can find details at vincafstl.org. You can also connect with us on social at We Are Slam or at Venture Cafe STL.
This is where it all begins, so say